Tonight, we are joined by Rader-Day, who has been honored with some of the most prestigious awards in mystery writing and fiction. She has been nominated for the Edgar Award and has won the Agatha, Anthony, and Mary Higgins Clark Awards. Besides tonight's topic, Death at Greenway, which won the Agatha Award, her books include The Lucky Ones, Under a Dark Sky, The Day I Died, Little Pretty Things, and The Black Hour. She lives in Chicago, where she is co-chair of the Mystery Readers Festival Midwest Mystery Conference, also known as Murder and Mayhem, and served as the national president of Sisters in Crime from 2019 to 2020. She teaches creative writing for Northwestern University's School of Professional Studies. Death at Greenway is a captivating suspense novel about nurses during World War II who come to Agatha Christie's holiday estate to care for evacuated children. When a body is discovered nearby, the idyllic setting becomes host to a deadly mystery. Bridey Kelly has come to Greenway House in disgrace. A terrible mistake at St. Prisca's Hospital in London has led to her dismissal as a nurse trainee, and her only chance for redemption is a position in the countryside caring for children evacuated to safety from the Blitz. Chasing 10 young children through the winding paths of the estate grounds might have soothed Bridey's anxieties and grief if Greenway were not situated so near the English Channel and the rising aggressions of war. Death at Greenway was the September selection of the Alameda Free Library's Mystery Book Club. And I finished it myself just yesterday and really enjoyed it. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. So please join me in welcoming Lori Rader-Day to our program. Lori, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, everybody. Thanks for logging in to see us tonight. I'm very happy to be here. Death at Greenway is my 6th book. It is my first, maybe my only historical, we'll see. My first 5 books were contemporary psychological suspense thrillers. So Death at Greenway is a little different for me. So I'm going to start by talking about where the idea came from, how I researched it, how I wrote it again. And I welcome questions. So I'm hoping to have some questions at the end. So I got the idea from Death at Greenway very unexpectedly. Ideas from my books come from all sorts of places. Maybe I think about a character that I want to write about, or a situation that I want to think about or explore, or an issue that I want to learn more about. For Death at Greenway, I was reading a book. We all love books, don't we? So I was reading a nonfiction book about Agatha Christie and how she works, called The Secret Notebooks of Agatha Christie by John Curran. And I loved Agatha Christie as a kid. She was one of the first writers for adults that I ever discovered. I was not an adult when I discovered her. I started reading her when I was about 10. I was a big user of my local public library, and I had pretty much scrounged everything out of the children's section. I was bugging the children's librarian for more recommendations, and I think she was a little sick of me. And she said, well, you've read everything down here, go upstairs. And I didn't want to go upstairs because that's where my mom was. And I knew that she would send me back down. So I was a little worried about going upstairs past the scary librarian at the top of the stairs. So I went upstairs, but I ducked into the first room before the desk, and it was the mystery room where I discovered Agatha and Mary Higgins Clark. Way too young for Mary Higgins Clark, but I loved those 2 writers, and it became, they were my favorites. And I did fall away from mystery for a while, but I think that was a really good foundation as a reader to the kind of writer that I would become. So I'm reading this nonfiction book about Agatha Christie and how she writes. She was a notebook girl for working out tricky story problems. She mostly, I believe, kind of wrote in her head and then wrote on the typewriter pretty directly her drafts. But when she was stuck, she'd go to a notebook. But she didn't have just one notebook per book, per project. That's what I do. She had a notebook here, a notebook there, around the house. She also had, at one point in her life, 8 different houses. So her notebook game was strong, extensive, but also a mess. And John Curran was the researcher who went in and cataloged all the notebooks and sort of pieced together how she had written her books over time. So it's fascinating and inspiring, but also really good bedtime reading, because before you know it, the book falls on your face. So in the introduction to that book was a single, maybe not even a full sentence, of like just a little string of maybe 5 or 6 words saying, as though everybody already knew, that Agatha's beloved home, Greenway, her holiday home, the home of her heart, was once used to house evacuees out of London, children who were escaping the expected bombings in London during World War II. So about 3 million people were moved officially. There were some people who were moved unofficially. About 3 million officially moved out of metropolitan areas, London and all other big cities in England. This is separate from the Kindertransport in Germany. Some of them went overseas, some went to America, some went to Canada, some went to Australia. Some went with their mothers, some went with their school groups. Many children went with their school groups, but 10 of those children went to Agatha Christie's house. And you can imagine, for somebody who loves Agatha Christie, and also, by the way, also a huge fan of the movie Bedknobs and Broomsticks. Has anybody heard of Bedknobs and Broomsticks? It's one of those Disney movies that I don't know, maybe they played it on TV once. I am a big fan, and it's early animation plus live action. So it's one of those movies where they have people, a very young, cute Angela Lansbury, and animation combined. So in the story, Angela Lansbury is an apprentice witch, and she is forced against her will to house 3 children, siblings who are orphaned. Actually, most kids in the stories are orphaned. Parents were boring, but and she doesn't want to, and they end up, helping her with magic. So it's a great story. And I'm reading this book about Agatha Christie, and she had kids at her house, and immediately I thought, it's Bedknobs and Broomsticks at Agatha Christie's house. And I had it all in my head, all of it. The problem is, when I started to research it later, what I learned first was there were 10 children. That's too many children. 10 children, and they were all under the age of 5. So, but early on, I didn't know that, and I definitely had an image of the kind of story I would write, and maybe it was a children's book. I didn't know. But the problem was, no matter what story it was, no matter what the children did and how old they were, it was going to be a British story. And as you can tell from my voice, I am not British. Now, I am very close. I love, I've been to England times. I have friends over there. But I'm not British. I'm also not a historian. I'm not even really a natural researcher. I'm an impatient kind of writer. I like to get started. The way I write books is I have an idea. I find a couple of points on the map, a few things I know that I want to explore, and I just go to the races. I just start writing. And so the idea of writing a story where I had to research everything was pretty scary. So I just sort of tucked the idea away. I kind of thought maybe at some point somebody would me to it. I missed the part where when I got the idea, I just wanted to read it. The original cut was like, oh, this is going to be an amazing story. I assumed it had been written before. And so I went to find it. I went to buy it just to read it. And what I found was that nobody had written it before. And then I thought, maybe, but except not British, not historian, not keen on looking things up. I just let it sit in my back pocket for years. Something like 4-5 years, actually. Wrote other books. I had projects already in the works. I had a contract I'd already signed, and so I was writing those books. Now in 2016, I believe, I had a chance to go to New York and meet my new editor at HarperCollins. And she wanted to know, what I wanted to do next. We had a nice lunch. It was the most New York thing I ever got, the most authory thing I ever got to do. But when I visited HarperCollins, there was a wall with Agatha Christie's big face on it. And I was like, oh, I love Agatha Christie. It was her face made out of her words, out of her, like a quote from her book. And I'm like, oh, I want to be that kind of author. I want to be an Agatha Christie type of author. And I said to my editor, I have an idea for an Agatha Christie type, like it has her house in it. And she's like, oh, I want to hear about that. So later on after lunch, she said, okay, tell me. So I told her the idea, just not even a pitch, just, Agatha Christie's house during World War II. And she's like, yeah, not next. And I'm like, oh, no, not next. Are you crazy? And so I went ahead with the projects that I had lined up. And then the next time my contract came up, she asked me, I had this book that I had written, the entire book, and they went to buy that, the lucky one, the one that came out in 2020. Not a great year for a book to come out, by the way. And they wanted to know, what do you want to do after that? Here's this full book that you're offering us. Yes, we want it, but what do you want to do next? And I thought, well, the idea I have is, and she said, yes, that. So what that meant was the project that had been someday, maybe I'll figure it out. And I had been sitting on it for 5 to 6 years, became my next project in a minute. In an afternoon, I suddenly realized I had to figure out this project. So research, for somebody who didn't actually know how to do research, I had to figure out how to do the research and then do it. When I think research, I think, of course, reading books. That's the best part, right? I love to read. So I made a study of Agatha Christie's books. Why not, right? If I'm going to research, I can read Agatha Christie books and call it work. Sounds great to me. So I did that. I especially circled around a book called Dead Man's Folly, which is a book Agatha wrote that features Greenway. Now she's changed the names of everything and some of the people, but it gives a really good sense of the community and who's there and what the house is like. She added the folly that man is found in isn't there, but everything else is pretty much exactly the way she describes it there. She's just changed the name of the house. She also has herself in there. She fictionalized herself. And then there was one of her mysteries had Ordeal of Innocence had a war nursery, is what they call it, a war nursery, as part of the story. So I read that one with great interest. And then I read all of her books that were published during the war and then written during the war. So I kind of know where she was in her career. And then I started reading books about her. I had already read John Curran's book, but I studied her autobiography and the books about her, not really knowing exactly how much Agatha would be in the book. And as I did my research, I realized, she's not going to be in this book very much at all, because she very famously went to London during World War II. She, during World War I, was she was kind of a nurse figure. I can't remember if she wouldn't have been a real nurse, but she had a position helping at an infirmary. And then she specialized and became an apothecary assistant, so like a pharmacy assistant, and made medicines. And so a lot of her expertise in poison is gleaned in this way. She came by it very honestly. So when World War II broke out, her husband was, he spoke Arabic, and so he was useful to the war effort, and he went to do that in London. And this is her second husband, Max Mallowan. She wanted to be near him, so she went to London, and she brushed off her skills and went back and became an apothecary's assistant again at the University Hospital London. So she wasn't really at the house that much, but she rented the house directly to this group of people. She talks about it in her autobiography. And so I had the last name of the people who had brought the group down, a few details about them. And so that was one of the things that I wanted to research. So I researched Greenway, the area, the war. I'm not a World War II expert. I had to learn that. And then I was trying to figure out who is in the house. If Agatha's not in the house, who's in the house with this group of 10 children? Agatha said the Mr. and Mrs. Arbuthnot, no first names. Thank you, Agatha. And then the 10 children, great. And then 2 hospital nurses. Those 2 hospital nurses, not nannies, but hospital nurses, were to become very, very important to this book, because they were the 2 people who were in the situation that were not named. They were lost to history. No one knows who they are. The children might still be alive. Everyone else is probably already gone, but they were real figures. And again, not a researcher, but I wanted, my goal was to find as much fact as I could, use the stuff that made sense to use. And then when I ran out of fact, that's where the fiction would happen. I knew that would have to be fiction. I'm a crime writer, and as far as I know, no actual crime happened in the house while the children were there. And no one would be able to tell me anyway. So I had to insert some aspect of fiction into the story. But my goal was to use as much as I could find. And since nobody had written about it, I was, doing a lot of original research. But who was in the house? And I got a little bit of help from the estate, the Agatha Christie estate. They were able to sort of give me a couple of facts that I could help figure out who was in the house. The Arbuthnot's, they had actually heard from someone who said, oh, my husband's family was, the couple, the Arbuthnot's. But I asked the person at the estate, do you know if that's true? And he said, no, we don't have any proof. And then I knew that Agatha says in her autobiography that she left the butler and his wife, the cook, behind to help care for this group. They had a butler. I love that part. It's my favorite. So I wanted to find out who those people were. And there was a man who was sort of famously Agatha Christie's butler, who went on speaking tours later in life and that sort of thing, talking about her. But I learned that he had interviewed with Agatha for the job at one of her apartments, and she she didn't have that apartment until 1956 or 8. So he was not the butler in question here. So Ancestry.com is a fascinating place to live your life. At one point, I literally lived there for about 6 weeks. But I managed to find in Ancestry.com documents that helped me triangulate information that proved the Arbuthnot's, who they were, and I found the butler and the cook, a married couple. So I am using real people as much as possible. And I don't know anything about them, so they are, figment of fiction based on some of the information I found out about the real people. For instance, to think of a butler being left behind at the house to care for refugee children and some chaperones and some nurses, I thought, oh, he's not going to care about that. That's not what a butler is for, right? But in researching the real butler, I found that when he was a child, he lost his mother quite young, and his father was sent to a workhouse. And he, his brother and sister were all put in children's homes. So he and his brother were put into a boys' home, separated from their sister. And then were only out of that situation when his sister came of age and got married and got both her brothers out. And he became a footman and then a butler. And so it became generative. The research became generative to the story because I realized he would actually be someone who would have a little bit more sympathy for these children than I would have imagined on my own. So the best kind of research I did was in person. So I was able to visit Greenway as a tourist. A friend of mine lives in England and flew to meet her, and she drove me around and we had the best time. I didn't know how much I could find there, but I thought I'm just gonna go and see what I can learn about this moment in Greenway's history. And there was very little about this moment in the house, actually. There's a little bit about the war. After the children were there, they were actually kicked out because the Admiralty requisitioned the house. So the nation said, no, you're out. We need the house for military. And a group of US Coast Guard officers moved into the house, and then there were sailors in other parts around the area. I'll talk to you more about that. But in the house, this is still evident because in the library, in Agatha Christie's library, where she used to work, there's a frieze painted around the top of the room. It's scenes from this flotilla from their adventures together up until the moment where they're, here in England. And it's painted in blues and grays of the military, the paints they had available to them. And it's quite good. It's very well done. It's so well done that when Agatha got the house back, eventually, many years later, they had to change some things to have this big group of men in the house, including adding 14 latrines. She, of course, had them remove the latrines before they gave the house back, and they did. But she had them keep the frieze, the painted frieze, because she liked it, and she liked that the house would be remembered as having a role in the war, which I was happy to learn. So while I was there visiting, I finally just asked one of the docents, is there anything in the house that is about this moment in the war before the Coast Guard officers were here, when the children were here? And she said, well, over here in this little pamphlet, just copied into sleeves, booklet we have, there's a letter from one of the children. She wrote to us and told us some things. Letter, you say, from one of the children. I was very excited. So in the pamphlet, they had just sort of copied out a little section about, it was mostly about evacuation generally. Supposing you didn't know anything about evacuation, it told you a little bit about it generally. And then she had stayed in the house. And then there's a picture of her, little cute girl with pigtails, and her name is Doreen. And I think I fell in love with Doreen. She was adorable. And the docent said, oh, and there's one more thing I can show you. So she took me upstairs and opened with a key a door that they don't let the public generally see. And there was a cabinet with doors. When you open the doors, shelves. And on the shelves were the names of the 5 girls who had been in the group. I think there were 5 girls and 5 boys. These are the girls. And so I had their real names. And if I had been cautious or ambivalent about being the person who told this story up until this moment, this is when the story became mine. And I thought, they're going to have to take this out of my dead cold hands. I am so interested in this story and finding a way to tell it. It also was a moment where I realized this is an ancient history here. This is not that far back. So I'm nervous about the historical, getting it right, but it's possible to get it right. It's possible, and it's not that far back. So I'm going to give it a shot. So I wrote the book after I got back from that trip. I wrote a draft of the book, let's say. And it was okay. It wasn't quite what I'd hoped it'd be. And I submitted it to my editor, and they gave me some notes. And well, actually, that's later. So wrote part of the book. That's what it was. Sorry, wrote part of the book. And then in 2019, I went back to Greenway. I took my husband this time, and this time we were the guests of Greenway. We got to stay there. The National Trust let us stay at the house. We were there for 3 nights, 4 days. And if you think, is that the best thing that's ever happened in your writer life? Yes, it is one of the top things that's ever happened to me as a writer, staying in Agatha Christie's house. They actually have apartments on the top floor, which is where the group would have actually stayed. And you could stay there. Actually, the National Trust rents apartments in some of their properties, including Greenway. I imagine it's a little tough to get in there. I would want to be there. And it was full, it was all booked up, but they have one room that they reserve for dignitaries. And I was able to talk to Sophie Hannah, the author who continues the Poirot series for the estate of Agatha Christie. She came to the conference that I run here in Chicago, and I got a chance to tell her about my story, and then I had sold it and I was going to have to write it now. And she said, "Oh, you have to talk to Belinda." And like, I would love to talk to Belinda. Who's Belinda? Belinda was the person at the National Trust who could get me into this bed sit. That's what they call it. Because if you're in the room and you need to sit down, you're going to be sitting on the bed. It's a small room, and it's really a one-person room. So my husband was very lucky to be invited, and he is very lucky that we get along very well. It is that kind of size of room. But we were there. We had a great time. We didn't have access to a kitchen, so we had to like carry in like fruit and bread and cheese and that sort of thing. But did I mention that I have a tea obsession, that I drink tea every morning? I had to get my tea at 10 a.m., no earlier, from the cafe at Greenway, because that's when they opened and that's when I could have access to tea. So I had a cream tea breakfast 3 mornings. I highly recommend living like Agatha Christie. It's pretty sweet. So we had a great time. And what I was doing there the second time was finding out all the things about Greenway and the area that I didn't know I needed to know when I came the last time. The last time I was just like fact finding, just like trying to get a lay of the land and see, where to start. This trip was about getting those details nailed down. I had at this point realized I needed to get those nurses off Greenway land and into town. So they would have to walk. I mean, they didn't have access to, the car. So we walked to town. It was 2 miles uphill both ways, I guarantee it. And that taught me they're not going to take the children. The children are going to have to stay at the land. So, sort of really getting boots on the ground, to use a military term, which is so valuable. When I came back, I finished the draft. Not a great draft, a draft, and sent it to my editor, got some notes. And then this is about February of 2020. Does anybody remember February of 2020? I had a book out, and I had many months of travel planned to promote it. And then suddenly that wasn't happening. So I had to roll up all those plans that I had made and instead sit in this room and look at these notes I had about my book draft and dedicate myself to revisions. Now I had time to dedicate myself. We all had a lot of time on our hands. Some of you may have made a lot of bread around then. Some of you were making a lot of bread. On Facebook, there were a lot of free concerts and, just a lot of community. We can get through this. We can do it. And while I appreciated all of that, I found myself in this room scared. Early days of pandemic, I knew that it wasn't going to be a couple of weeks. It wasn't going to be a month. It was a serious deal. It was going to be a while, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen. So I sat in this room and I looked at my notes and I was trying to work, and I thought to myself, I don't have the Blitz spirit, I thought to myself in this room in Chicago in 2020. I don't have the Blitz spirit. And I thought, okay, now I understand these people in the book a lot better than I did a few months back. And one of them, the main character, the nurse, Bridey, doesn't have the Blitz spirit. That is her. And I had to figure out why she didn't have it, what she was dealing with. And so the entire book changed in that moment. And I was able to write from a much more knowledgeable experience of being kept away from where you wanted to be and from the people you loved. So I would never thank the pandemic for this. The pandemic was not a good time for anybody, and we lost a lot of good people. But that's what I did with my pandemic. I rewrote my book entirely. So one of the things that happened, right, I don't remember exactly when I started this search, but I went looking for Doreen. Do you remember Doreen, little 6-year-old Doreen with her pigtails? She's the only one of the children from the group who ever reached back to Greenway to say, this was me. I was there, and here's what I remember. I was able to get my hands on that letter. The National Trust gave me a copy, and it had an email address on it. But who keeps an email address for that long? Well, you know who keeps an email address for that long? Doreen. So I was able to get in touch with Doreen and also her son on Facebook. I tracked her down a couple different ways just to make sure nobody thought I was some kind of shyster. I look pretty shady, right? So I was able to email with Doreen, and we still do. We became email pen pals. She just turned 84. It's delightful to get to talk to her. She wrote that letter several years ago, probably I think in 2008, maybe. So she wrote down everything she remembered about being an evacuee. She was actually in several different places because once the group got sent away from Greenway, they went to another house, and then they went to another house. So she, but she remembered a lot that was specifically Greenway, was obviously Greenway. She remembers the butler. So I used as much as I could of her memories, and then I went looking for her because I just wanted to know her. I had her memories. She doesn't remember much more than that. But in talking to her, we had some great conversations that would spur her memory of things that she had totally forgotten. A nickname that her dad called her when she was young. Her dad is long gone, but she was excited that nickname came back so she could tell her kids, her granddaughter. So that's been probably the most rewarding aspect of this, and unexpected, right? Like a lot of it, I thought, well, it went the way I hoped it would, but getting to know Doreen was totally unexpected. I don't have that many friends who are 84, but I do now. So that's been really a great time. So the book came out in October 2021, just over a year now. And I launched it, had a big tea party after I was vaccinated, standing on my friend's Victorian porch, talking to people outside, having tea. It was a lot of fun. I mean, everything about this book has been just a ton of fun. It's been really, it was hard. It was very challenging. It was the most challenging project of my life, but it's also been full of joy and some of it rather unexpected and surprising. So it recently won the Agatha Award at the Mouse Domestic Conference, the perfect award for this book. So so the question is Doreen ever reunited with her family? Yes. Doreen, like I said, many of the people evacuated, the children evacuated, were not orphans. They were leaving families that just wanted them to survive the war. We've seen some of that, in Ukraine and other places. So she did go back to her family. That picture that was taken of her that was in Greenway was when she was returned to her family. Her parents took that picture. So yeah, she actually would have seen her parents during the war as well. Not a lot. When they were evacuated, they were pretty far from home, and so they did not see each other very often. But the trains had like deals, special tickets for parents to go visit their children where they were evacuated in the country. So you know, she had pictures of being at Greenway, and her family would have been the ones to take those pictures. So yeah, she went back. She did tell me in her memory, she talks about how when she went back, she had her own room. And well, first of all, the house was small. Doreen was used to big houses now, right? She was gone for almost the age of 2, not quite the age of 2, to the age of 6. So she was gone from her family for a good solid 4 years. So when she got to their house, it was small, and she had her own room, and she didn't want her own room. She missed her friends. And she also thought that she might be adopted. And her parent and these people were too scared to tell her the truth that she was adopted. Which is heartbreaking, right? I mean, there's nothing about this story that isn't heartbreaking. I'm getting joy from it, but you know, it was war, and it was hard for everybody. There were stories of parents who went to take their children to put them on the trains and then couldn't do it. You know, they couldn't let them go. But the people who were sending their children away, all they wanted was for their children to make it through. And most of the children would have gone back to their parents. Some would not have. Some of the children who went overseas might have stayed there. Sometimes they had families, but by the time they spent 4 years in Australia, you know, that might be their family. So it was a case-by-case situation. I'm open to questions in the chat, but I do have some pictures I thought I might real quickly buzz through if I can find.
We'd love to see speaking for myself, would love to see your pictures.
Just making sure I get the right one here. Is it well, it's not going to let me. Oh, that's too bad. I don't know how to fix that. If Renisha, if you know how to fix that. Okay, let's take some questions. If anybody has questions, type them in the chat. I do have a little section of the book that I sometimes read. So let me do that while you are thinking about.
I've got a question while you're queuing that up.
Sure.
One of the things that struck me in what I thought was sort of a central theme was identity. And so you start off with, there were 2 hospital nurses, and what ends up in the book are these 2 very complex, start my video, very complex young women who aren't who they say they are. And I'm just wondering how that leap happened, because it was fascinating.
You know, because of the way I write, I am often sort of going, you know, learning as I go, discovering the story as I go. And one of the things that's one of the things that occurred over the course of writing the story. So Agatha Christie wrote a lot about identity, right? The people who are saying they're something that they're not, or finding out that someone is different than you thought. And that just seemed like a very interesting thing to pull, you know, from her work, to borrow from her work, something that she was very preoccupied with.
Oh, that's
and the
cool.
other thing was, because I'm writing about war, war time is one of those times where society is shaken up, and people can take advantage of that for good or bad. So for instance, one of the characters in the book, Mr. Arbuthnot, I figured out, okay, this is really the guy. He and his wife were at the house. And so I researched those real people. And it turned out that Mr. Arbuthnot is not named Mr. Arbuthnot. That's not his real name. He was actually a famous painter and photographer. He was a man that people knew by Arbuthnot. But when I looked him up as a person in Ancestry and a person in the document, it turns out that's actually not his name. He changed it at some point when he was a young man, probably to separate himself from his father, who he did not enjoy the company of. And I'm not sure exactly what the relationship was there, but to separate himself from his, no good dad, he changed his name. But as far as anybody can tell, he didn't do it officially. He just changed what he called himself. These are different days, right? But also it was, just a time of a different war. He chose that moment to become somebody else. And that seemed like the sort of thing that could easily happen in a moment where people are a little distracted by the situation.
Yeah. So we've got some questions. Do you think you will write another historical mystery? And also, was it difficult to fictionalize the history?
It was very, very difficult to fictionalize the history. It was difficult to research the history, and then it was difficult to figure out how to slip story in between all the things that I was learning. I got a little obsessive, if you can imagine that. Somebody who doesn't really like research is going to get obsessive and about including all these details and making it real. Several people would ask, like, why don't you just, if you wanted the kids to be, 5 kids at age 10, so you could have your bed knobs and broomsticks, why don't you just make it that? And, there are probably books where people have just been, I'll just change that. I don't like that about Greenway. I'm gonna just make it different. But because it hadn't been written before, because I was discovering it all and putting it all together, I thought I just wanted to use what's out there. I kind of expected to run out of fact a lot earlier is the thing. And then I could, rely on fiction for most of it. But I kept finding things that were useful, details about Arbuthnot that I'm like, well, now I gotta talk about that guy. Details about the butler. Oh, he's an interesting guy. Oh, I need to write from his perspective a little bit. So, a book that got a little unwieldy because there were so many interesting real things that I learned, so many real people who were story worthy. I ended up with 8 point of view characters. 8. That's too many. But I think that they all do really good work for the story. One of them is Doreen. That was how I could get the real story from the children into the book. I could use her letter and these specific instances that she remembers and let her tell that story. Let a character named Doreen tell the story. Will I ever write another historical novel? I'll get back to you on that. It was a tough project, but it was also really rewarding, sort of, in relation to that. So I have other ideas and we'll see. My next novel is actually a contemporary. It has no title. It is not done, but it's out next fall.
Okay. I just wanted to say, when you flipped into Doreen's point of view, I was surprised. I wasn't expecting to see any of the book from that level, but I really appreciated it as the novel went on. It was interesting. So was the organization of the Watchers, such as Gigi, is that a real historical organization?
It is. It really existed. So in the book, for those who have not read it, the group, and I always forget their name. If anybody has read the book or wants to type it in the chat, do that. It's a real social sciences experiment in England. It started around the time that the king abdicated for Wallace Simpson. Yes, mass ob. Thank you. I knew somebody had read it and could type it in there. Mass observation is the name of the experiment. And so what it is people going to places where your average Joes and Jills are hanging out in England at this time, and just listening to what they have to say about the king abdicating. What are they saying in the food, in the markets? What are they saying in the pubs about this situation? And it was just a project somebody started. It wasn't, the crown saying, what are you saying about me? It wasn't the government saying, what are people saying? It was someone who was interested in knowing what the average English person thought about the world. And so it was started, and then it did actually have some work to do during World War II. They did some, they would take a look at propaganda posters and things like that. They were using some of the research they were doing about what people thought about the war to make propaganda to in fact tell mothers, don't go get your kids out of evacuation. That's dangerous for them.
Right.
Leave him there, mother, said one of the posters. So that's the kind of work they were doing. And I don't think it works anymore, but it did last for a very long time. And there was lots of books covering what they researched, what people were saying, and then books about that group. I could write an entire book about mass op. They were very interesting.
Do you want to close out with a reading then? Because we don't have other questions.
And I'm sorry about the slideshow I have. For some reason, the sharing, we didn't test it out ahead of time and it didn't work. So what I'll do is I will find a way to post that on my website. And if anybody's interested in that, check out Lori Rader-Day, all one word, no hyphen, .com. I'll try to get it up so it's there tomorrow so you guys can see it. And I have some real cute pictures of stuff from the war and the house and that sort of thing. So this is just at the train station, and Bridey is the one telling what's going on. The children were tots, baby fat in their knees, below shorts and skirts, socks pulled up or sliding, shoes scuffed or untied. They had tags affixed to their coats and child-sized gas masks in paper cases on straps around their necks. They wore caps and hats or bonnets and flung them to the ground in a tantrum. Those who were carried by their moms kicked to be let down. 2 were infants, dear God. Porters followed behind with pillow slips stuffed, picnic hampers, tiny cases ridiculous in large hands. Very few fathers were in evidence. Fathers were at the front or already in hospital, or worse. It was best not to think of fathers. Some carried bears or dolls or toy planes or tanks. Each child was allowed a favorite. As the platform filled, a young boy stopped running his pet locomotive along his mother's sleeve and looked on the soft toys the girls carried with hungry eyes. Comfort, too, would be rationed. So that's our tots getting ready to go on the train.
It really pulls at you. So many thanks for a very informative and entertaining conversation. I know that I have learned an immense amount from this talk and from reading the book. And I'm sure our audience has also. There is a link in the chat, which will take you directly to the Books Inc. page where you can purchase this fascinating book on your own. And I hope that this talk has motivated you to do so. In closing, I want to remind folks that Death at Greenway is also available locally at Books Inc., and you can check it out from the library, of course. A reminder to consider a donation to the Friends of the Alameda Free Library at alamedafriends.com or through the link posted in the chat. It will help us continue to produce events like this one. Also, if you have a friend who missed this talk, you can tell them it will be available on YouTube in the next few days. They can check the alamedafriends.com website for a link. Our next Friends at Home event will be a docent-led discussion on California pop. California artists may follow styles that originate in Europe or New York, but they put their own stamp on them. Sometimes a bit more irreverent, sometimes more down to earth, but always full of California color and verve. In 1962, pop art, the flip and hip answer to the soulful abstract expressionism of the 1950s, burst onto the art scene when the Ferris galleries on I do not know Spanish, I apologize. Anyway, in Los Angeles, the Fergus Gallery exhibited Andy Warhol soup cans. Local artists were mining the same territory, bringing objects of contemporary life like ice cream cones, gas stations, and the Goodyear blimp into art. So learn about a few of the California pop stars: Ed Ruscha, Wayne Theobald, Joan Brown, Roger Kuntz, and Robert Colescott in this talk. We will be guided in this exploration by one of our favorite docents, Avril Angevine. Avril is an independent art lecturer who has spoken at the Alameda Library many times. She is a humanities and English instructor at the local colleges and a museum guide at both SF MoMA and the Oakland Museum. I would like to take time to thank the team that makes these events happen: David Beal, Karen Manuel, Karen Romer, Renisha Robinson, Kumar Fantz, Karen Butter, Catherine Adcox, Billy Reinschmidt, and Becky Sayre. And a special thanks again to our guest, Laura Rader-Day, for an entertaining program. And finally, thanks to all of you for joining us this evening.